Okay, let's go to Vancouver. Tony, if you hear me, I'll go ahead with my question. Great, at last. Okay, we got the problem fixed. Now, Tony, let me sum up the three questions I asked John in a nutshell. I want you to tell us why UK congressmen, UK actually MPs, wait to hear about this decision that's already been made in the US regarding such a major defense, as they call it, issue in the UK, and they should hear it from a Pentagon official in the first place.
Well, look, the thing to note about this is there is currently quite a serious spat going on between the United States and the UK. We had the refusal of Boris Johnson and the British cabinet to endorse Trump's demand that Huawei technology was not used in the UK on our mobile data networks, and the independent, just about, security services in Britain, that is to say GCHQ and the other security services, all decided that they didn't believe there was any security threat, and that this was just an attempt by Trump to bully Britain in a trade war to accept American products rather than Chinese products. And by the way, a trade war that Trump is losing. And so this, I think, this release of this information in the US is deliberately aimed as a kind of shot across the bows at Boris Johnson. It's a bit of a tit for tat going on here, because this is secret information. At some point, someone in the US has said, right, well, let's release this. This will really embarrass Boris. And of course it will. And our other correspondent we just heard from, I don't think it's really fair to talk about this as a kind of Brexit-related issue, because the relationship between Britain and the United States has been very problematic for about 60 or 70 years. And we, as the British public and the British journalists, have had to watch as the United States has completely taken over many of our industries, including our defence industry, and specifically and particularly nuclear weapons defence. I mean, we've seen other industries, car and aircraft industries, shut down, ship manufacturing industries almost completely closed, electronics industries, computer industries, and this is all really to make sure that Britain has not got an independent ability to fight for itself. Even the steel industry, through the European takeover by people like Krupp's, an attempted shutdown of the entire steel industry in Britain. So it means that Britain is no longer, as it was 60 or 70 years ago, in any position to independently get involved in an international conflict. There was also, about the decision-making process in Britain here that decided all this secretly. I mean, you know, Boris has been keeping key decisions from the UK press, public and MPs. This is appalling, but it's not the first time. Back in the 1980s, we had a series, believe it or not, on the BBC called Secret Society, which, by the way, was made in Scotland, showing that secret cabinet committees were being used in the initial decisions around spending on the Trident submarines. So we can see that these sorts of decisions are considered too important to be allowed to be made by MPs and by the Prime Minister in Britain, and not to be scrutinised by either the press or the public. So we live in a very diluted and denuded democracy, and of course we're being slowly subsumed into an American empire.
Yep, Tony, some experts and politicians alike are wondering why the UK should commit itself to staunching nuclear proliferation and reliance on the US for a major part of its defense strategy.
Well, the reliance upon the US is, I don't think, the choice of British armed forces. It's the politicians that are doing this. And I mean, there is also, remember, the decision as to whether or not to use these weapons. There's a battle going on in the United States right now, and there has been for years, but particularly recently, between the Senate and the White House about the war powers. Who can actually decide to press the button and launch the force? So it's by no means certain that if these weapons were to be used, you know, remember, one of the most important things to understand about Trident is it's because it's all a US designed and engineered system. The US has an effective veto on any UK use of it. Britain had its own nuclear weapons program. The first nuclear weapon exploded by the Brits in 1952, but slowly but surely that independence has been taken away. The US has a veto, like I say, on our decisions, and that is a bit like the Roman Empire, really. America wants us to pay for these nuclear weapons, but they want to decide where and when to use them. This cost is incredible. We've heard in the news story in The Observer around about 31 billion pounds. That's $40 billion. But the total cost has also been exposed by the Observer a few months ago as 205 billion in total. That includes all of the extras that you need. The warhead's just one little part of it.
Wow, interesting. Now let's go to John. Now, John, it was reported in January that the budget to maintain Trident nukes had overrun by more than £1 billion after the MOD failed to learn from its past mistakes. Is there any assurance such things won't happen again?
Oh, of course not. We've seen a lot of these big ticket projects going over budget over time. And as I said at the start of my comments, the absolute amount that this is expected to cost is 70 billion over the lifetime, 30 to 40 years of this generation of Trident nuclear weapons. So it's an actual outrage when you consider the problem the country has after 10 years of Tory austerity, where the poorest and the most vulnerable have been nailed to the cross, figuratively speaking, suffering unprecedented levels of poverty and despair. Homelessness is a crisis. People are dying, literally dying in the street. And Tony's right about the lack of public scrutiny. This presupposes a ruling class or a ruling establishment that views the people as an enemy, or at least a potential enemy, and that cannot be trusted. And it's very significant that we are having this discussion on the day that Julian Assange's hearings on possible extradition to the US for exposing the war crimes of the US in Iraq and Afghanistan takes place in London. And this development has come to light. That tells you the kind of world that we are living in. It's not a world that's ruled by peacemakers, it's a world ruled by war makers, or at least those who author the means by which to wage those wars. And I'd just like to take up Tony's point about me mentioning Brexit. I don't think there's any argument to be had that, yes, Britain has been reliant on US leadership, or has grafted itself to US leadership on the world stage since the Second World War, and that was intensified after the crisis in Suez in 1956. But it's certainly going to deepen now. It's going to intensify because Britain needs that bilateral trade deal with Washington in this post-Brexit economic landscape. And it's a very dangerous place for Britain to be when we are so dependent on a very, very capricious administration led by Donald Trump and staffed by unreconstructed neocons like Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence with John Bolton in the background. This is an administration of an empire, which Tony rightly describes, that is on the wane. And when an empire is on the wane, as history has shown, it is at its most dangerous, having to rely on force in order to maintain its power on the world stage. So it's a very dangerous place for us to be. And in terms of the media, let me just make this point.
Okay,
we
briefly.
don't have a mainstream media that holds the powerful to account on behalf of the people. We have a mainstream media in Britain today that holds the people to account on behalf of the powerful. And on this question of Trident, in the run-up to the general election, Jeremy Corbyn was excoriated by interviewer after interviewer by saying that he would refuse, if Prime Minister, to use Trident nuclear weapons under any circumstances. So therefore, the idea of leadership in the UK is seen as someone who's willing to incinerate millions of people in the name of defence. And this shows you the moral sickness that in which this ruling establishment is currently drowning.
Unfortunately, right. Now, Tony, major powers, we're looking at it from a broader perspective now. Apart from Trident, you know, major powers like the US, the UK, and some others, they've always pushed other countries to stay away from, you know, nuclear proliferation. Now, the question is, what makes these countries think that they can do what they're forbidding others from doing?
Well, I suppose it's because apparently we got there first. But look, I mean, let's call a truce on whether we want to be part of a Brussels-led or a Washington-led empire. We actually, I don't think, want to be part of either. And we need to push to be an independent nation. That's the only way that our democratic vote, when we get it every 5 years, can really be valid as an independent nation. But the problem here, of course, is looking at this. You know, it would be almost unthinkable to see the use of nuclear weapons. The thing is that there's a great deal of evidence in the United States that there is a serious tribe of maniacs. I mean, the Dr. Strangelove film wasn't such an exaggeration as historians have found out. That there are people in the United States that would seriously do a first nuclear strike, and they're looking at various different ways that they can manage to do that. So people don't want to think about this. It is unthinkable, but in the US military circles, it is thinkable. The effects of a nuclear war, well, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has said there's around 16,000 nuclear weapons out there, 200 or so of which are sitting in Israel, and 10 million fatalities would take place in just a small nuclear war, say, for example, between India and Pakistan. A nuclear winter would bring temperatures down for several months, maybe 3 or 4 months, 30 degrees Celsius down from whatever they are in whatever part of the world you are now, and that would still remain 6 degrees lower even 3 years after a nuclear war. So the world would be horrifically affected if these weapons could use. And Stephen Gardiner, who's a former nuclear weapons launch officer in the United States, told me on one of the programs I did that a deliberate mistake, that's the way he put it, could trigger a war. In other words, they're looking at ways to say, oh, we're really sorry, but a nuclear war has now started, as they tried to do, by the way, in Cuba several times.
Okay, we're running out of time. John, very quick question. Where's the planet moving? You know, Tony mentioned part of it. You know, U.S., Israel, they're adding to their nuclear arsenals instead of joining nuclear non-proliferation treaties. 30 seconds, please.
Well, it's all about hegemony in the last analysis. It's all about power for the sake of power. It's all about geostrategic interests, and this is a function of capitalism in our time. Capitalism is an economic model that needs constant growth, and that constant growth requires constant access to new markets and new sources of raw materials. It's over 700 US military bases in over 80 countries around the world. No one in the right mind should think that those exist in order to keep the world safe for democracy. They really exist to keep the world safe for US Western corporations to be able to plunder the planet's natural resources and human resources without any resistance. That's the kind of world we're living in. It's a world of empire, and it's only in resistance to empire that we will be able to develop a different sort of reality. We need to move towards a multipolar world. We are doing so. It's a very dangerous.
Okay, we're out of time. I'm sorry, I have to jump in. Let me thank our guests, writer and political commentator John White from Edinburgh, investigative journalist Tony Gosling from Vancouver. Thank you for watching this debate. We'll see you soon.